Hey, it is Kenny's Audiophile Record Reviews. Thank you very much for viewing my channel. Please like and subscribe. I sincerely appreciate that. In this video, I'm going to show you or reveal some of the 80s music and albums that I was actually buying in the 80s. Now, this video is going to feature albums that were actually produced and released in the 80s, and albums that I was buying in the 80s. Now, this video is not going to include albums from like the 50s, 60s, and 70s that I was buying in the 80s. It's only going to include, like other genres like jazz, R&B, pop, soul. It's not going to include 50s, 60s, and 70s R&B, jazz, pop, soul, jazz fusion. It's only going to include albums that I was actually buying and listening to in the 80s, and albums that were actually produced and released in the 80s. I'm restricting into that. And this is a very small sample size. This is actually approximately 35 records. It's just a small sample size of some of the records I was buying during that time. And like I said, these things, as I always say in these videos, my music taste is my music taste, and I think this is some of the best. And like I said, these things are always subjective. What you like and listen to is different from what I like and listen to, and I respect your choices. I hope you respect mine. But like I said, only albums that were produced and released in the 80s that I was buying in the 80s. I'm going to show you the actual album covers, and I'm trying to go through these rather quickly, because like I said, there's at least 35. And I'm going to start with one of the greatest singers of all time, and not the greatest, and that's Luther Vandross, and this great album. I was blessed to see him in person one or two times in the 80s. And this includes a song, Never Too Much, and A House Is Not a Home, the Burt Bacharach, Hal David masterpiece. Luther Vandross, Left Us Too Soon, one of the greatest, if not one of the greatest singers of all time, Luther Vandross. And I was into Suzanne Vega. There's an album that includes the song Luca, Suzanne Vega. I was buying her records and listening to her in the 80s. And the 80s collection is not complete without including Prince, another master that left us too soon. I think my favorite Prince song is a song called Housequake. It just has this beautiful vibe and groove to it that's very infectious. Housequake by Prince. I forgot which album that song is on. I don't think it's on this one. This Prince, the master from the 80s. And I have to include an underrated trumpet player. I listened to him in the 80s. That's Wynton Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis. I was listening to him a lot in the 80s. He could play classical, jazz. And he's very versatile. Very versatile, extremely versatile as a trumpet player. Hiroshima, a fabulous instrumental and vocal group. This is one of my favorite album covers ever. I love how you can see, I believe it's LA City Hall right here in the background. Just a beautiful picture taken on an overcast Los Angeles day. Hiroshima. This was issued, I believe, in 1980. Mars, Pump Up the Volume. That's a absolutely fantabulous instrumental song with some vocals, but this has a nice club vibe and groove to it. Mars, Pump Up the Volume, one of my favorite songs of the 80s, for sure. I think this is just a single LP, if I recall, or maybe it's not. But Mars, Pump Up the Volume. Spectacular song. Sting, one of my favorites in the 80s. There's a song on here, I think it's called Russians. That's a great song. This is on A&M Records, I believe. Yes, it is. Sting. I was listening to Barbra Streisand, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and this is their Broadway album. I really enjoyed this album. I was listening to this when I was in college. There's some great tunes on this record. Barbra Streisand, the Broadway album. In the 80s, throughout the 80s, I was buying all the Sade albums. This is just one of them. Stronger Than Pride. And this is the one, Diamond Life, which is great as well. When that song Smooth Operator hit the, it's on this album, hit the scene, that put her on her map, she never left. This is her Promises album. Sade. Very good singer. I wish I could have seen her in person during that time. I failed to see her in the 80s, but I wish I did. I also was listening to Sinatra. I like his version of Sonny and Cher's, I think it's She Shot Me Down. I think it's on this record. Bang Bang, My Baby Shot Me Down. That's Frank Sinatra singing that song. You ought to check that out. Frank Sinatra in the 80s. The name of the album is She Shot Me Down. I was still listening to Ella Fitzgerald, Joe Pass, Count Basie around that time. Actually, I was. Saw Ella Fitzgerald and Joe Pass in concert at the Music Center in Los Angeles. My parents let me hang out with them during that concert and took me along. I was in, like I said, in college during those years. That was a good pass. There's Joe Pass on the guitar, Ella Fitzgerald vocals during that concert. That was a great concert. Although it was later in her career, she was actually pretty good. Ray Charles, Brother Ray is at it again. I bought this in my 20s, early 20s. There's a song in here, Don't You Love Me Anymore. That's actually pretty good. I was into that song when this album came out. And this singer, Lani Hall, she was with Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66. Although I enjoyed her, probably her 70s albums more. This is an 80s album. I had to include her in this batch because I love her as a singer. Like I said, she was lead singer with Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66. Married to the great trumpet player and entrepreneur Herb Alpert. So I had to include Lani Hall. She sang, I think she sang the song Never Say Never Again to the, I think Sean Connery's last James Bond movie, somewhere in the mid-80s, somewhere around that time frame. Lani Hall. Albany Park. Sorry about that. Antonio Carlos Jobim. I was listening to him. I was buying the 60s records, 70s records, 80s records. This is an 80s record by Antonio Carlos Jobim. I believe my older brother gave this record to me. I've since bought an extra copy or two because I love this album by Antonio Carlos Jobim, the Brazilian master. He was on that Gets Gilberto album that was a landmark album. The Butt. I love this song. I think this is the single. It has a couple of mixes of the song. The Butt is from the album of the School Days movie by Spike Lee. I really enjoyed Spike Lee's movies during that time. School Days, Do the Right Thing. I love that song, The Butt. Great song. Gotta check that song out. Linda Ronstadt. Now, I think this is an early 80s album, and she has a very great version of Hurt So Bad on this album. So I had to show this album in this video. Linda Ronstadt, the great Linda Ronstadt. And the young ladies in the background had to include Madonna. What a spectacular artist and performer she was in the 80s, for sure. Here's another one. Now, I had to include this soundtrack. Now, this is a very little known movie called Absolute Beginners. But there's 2 songs on this album you have to check out. And I'll leave these 2 songs, if I can remember, in the description below. But there's a song on here called Killer Blow by Sade that you have to check out. Killer Blow. I'll leave the link to that song in the description below. And the link I'm gonna leave you is from the movie. It's the her being featured in a movie as a singer. And the song is actually great, Killer Blow. I think it's one of her underrated songs. And there's another song by a group called the Counsil, and it's called Have You Ever Had It Blue? And I'll leave the link to those songs, the Counsil, Have You Ever Had It Blue, and Sade, Killer Blow, in the description below. Please check out those songs. Now, this album, although those songs are great songs, this album does not sound good at all. And I was very disappointed when I bought this album. but the song, the performances are good. Herbie Hancock's groundbreaking performance, dramatic performance, electronic rocket song is on this album Future Shock. He won a Grammy for the song Rocket. A few more to go. And like I said, we're going to get to the album that I think is the greatest album of the 80s when I get to the end of this record. At least my favorite, which I think is the greatest of the 80s. We're going to get to that at the end of this video. I was listening to Weather Report big time. Night Passages album, Weather Report, Jaco Pastorius, Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul. What a great group they were. What a great jazz fusion group they were. Here's another Weather Report album. There's a Weather Report of the same name. Peter Erskine, Jaco Pastorius, Wayne Shorter, who passed away recently, Joe Zawinul, Robert Thomas. What a great jazz fusion group Weather Report was. I was buying their stuff throughout the 80s. And this group just took me by surprise. I love the vibrant groove. Eurythmics. Annie Lennox. Sweet Dreams are made of this. Annie Lennox and Eurythmics. Herb Alpert had a resurgence around 1979 throughout the early to mid 80s. And this is his Keep Your Eye on Me album. I mean, he featured Janet Jackson on vocals. Diamonds is on here. He just revamped his style and groove to fit the modern times of the late 70s, early 80s. And this is one of his great albums of the 80s. Keep Your Eye on Me, Herb Alpert. This electronic jazz fusion group is just simply amazing. It was Pat Metheny, and this is his off-ramp album. And I love the song on here. It's I think it's called Are You Going With Me? I believe that's the name of the song. And this is a great jazz fusion album. This is a masterpiece as well, I think. The album just didn't sound, this album doesn't sound good, but the performance is over the top spectacular. Anita Baker and her masterful Rapture album. This is an amazing album. I just love her vocal performance. But when I play this album, it just sounds flat. I wish they could do something to clean up the sound and reissue this record if they haven't already. I know this album, which is close to an original pressing, does not sound good. It just sounds flat and dull to me. But her performance steals the show. Control by Janet Jackson. I saw her in person at the Forum in Inglewood, California. What a great show she put on. And this is her Control album, Janet Jackson. She was hot around that time. One of the great vocal groups of all time, Manhattan Transfer and a Vocalese album. This includes John Hendricks on vocals as well. I think this album may have won multiple Grammys at the Grammy Awards. What a great jazz vocal album this is. The song Killer Joe is amazing. Just a great, it's a great jazz album, jazz vocal album. I had to include my favorite jazz musician of all time, Miles Davis, We Want Miles. And this album has fabulous performances by Mike Stern on guitar. It's just amazing. And Miles Davis obviously plays well on this album. But this is a great Miles Davis, We Want Miles album. Issued 1982. Now, the next three albums in order, I think, are my top three albums for the 80s, in my opinion. Just the music I vibe and groove to, that I enjoy. These are my top three, and in this order. And this album is an underrated album. It was produced by Quincy Jones. I believe it was a Grammy Award winner. I'm pretty sure. George Benson, Give Me the Night. This album does not get the praise and the attention and the accolades it deserves. But this is one of my favorite albums of the 80s. I bought this when it first came out. Like I said, it was produced by Quincy Jones for Quincy Jones Productions. George Benson's guitar playing and vocals. Just amazing. I love this album. The song, obviously, "Give Me the Night." Star of a Story" is a fabulous song. And also, "Turn Out the Lamplight" is another great album. George Benson, "Give Me the Night," underrated album. If I were to rank albums from the 80s, I put this at number 3 on my list. Like I said, these things are subjective, and it's just there's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong answer. It's what you love, enjoy, and vibe to. What will come in second is a groundbreaking and historical, fabulous thriller, Michael Jackson. And this was a thriller, it was. I remember this came out. And, oh, by the way, I was in my 20s the entire decade of the 80s. So this was in my wheelhouse. I was in my 20s in the 80s. Matter of fact, this album came out. I was probably 21 years old when this album came out. What a, with Thriller, Beat It, Billie Jean. I think it is the second best album ever made in the 80s, in my opinion. Michael Jackson, Thriller, another Quincy Jones produced album. He produced "Give Me the Night" and this one. Quincy Jones doesn't get the props he deserves either. And I think this album I'm about to show you is a highly underrated album, a very little known album, and it's a movie soundtrack actually. And the movie is called "Round Midnight." Now, this album is a jazz album, and this movie came out when I was probably about 25, and I went to the movie, saw it like at least 4 or 5 times at that time. It was that great of a movie. It included the saxophone player, Dexter Gordon, and he was nominated. He actually is a saxophone jazz player by trade, but he was nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars for this movie. That's how great of a job Dexter Gordon did in this movie. But the playing of the musicians on this album, I'm just going to name a few. This is a Herbie Hancock produced soundtrack. Matter of fact, this album won for Best Original Score at the Oscars. That's how great this album is. But I'm going to give you some of the jazz greats on this album, just a small sample size. Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter bass, Tony Williams drums, Bobby McFerrin vocal. Now, Bobby McFerrin is making a sound with his voice that sounds like a trumpet, and it's very very unique and very it's just great to listen to. Matter of fact, before I got the album and I heard this, I thought it was a real trumpet. You have I think Tony Williams is on here, Pierre Michelot, the bass player, Chet Baker on vocals on the song "Fair Weather." Just many jazz greats are on this record. Cedar Walton is on this record. Billy Higgins. There's several others. I think this is the greatest album of the 80s for me personally. Herbie Hancock's masterpiece, original motion picture soundtrack, "Round Midnight," is the best album for me in the 80s. But nonetheless, that is a small sample size of some of the records that I was listening to in the 80s and purchasing in the 80s, and music that was actually issued in the 80s. Like I said, I was buying music from the 50s, 60s, 70s during the 80s, but this batch is just a small sample size of the records that were produced in the 80s and I was buying in the 80s. And they're amongst some of my favorites. There are some glaring omissions for sure. I'm sure when I post this video, I'm going to say, "Oh, Kenny, you forgot this. That's inevitable. That's going to happen." I did this small sample size to keep the video time a little short. I could have bought out, many more. But that's just a small sample size. If you have a favorite album from the 80s or group of albums from the 80s or favorite albums from the 80s, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you very much for viewing this video. I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe. God bless, strong love, and keep the peace worldwide.